And now we welcome Dr. Hilary Scarsella to share with us. Welcome, Dr. Scarsella.
Thank you. It is so good to be among you. As was said, I am a professor at Colgate Rochester Crozer Divinity School, and another connection you may or may not know is my connection with Into Account, which is an organization that supports survivors of sexual violence connected to communities of Christian faith. So I expect that you all are aware that I will be talking with you today about sexual violence. But just in case anybody missed that communication, I wanted to start by just naming that. I won't be sharing survivors' testimonies of violence, but I will be talking about forms of sexual violence perpetrated within first century Roman military contexts, and what this means for our communities today. So please hold that in mind and know that I encourage you to make empowered choices about whether and how you or your children will engage. I like titles. Titles help me stay on topic when I'm speaking. And the title that I gave to the reflection I want to offer tonight is Sexual Violence and Belief in the Wake of Crucifixion. I'm not convinced that when I use the word sexual violence that we all automatically have the same definition. So I want to say outright that I use this term as an umbrella term for all sorts of things that you might think would fit under the umbrella, like sexual assault, sexual harassment, domestic violence, and more. Today, I'm primarily using the term to refer to assault, abuse, and sexual humiliation. But I think it's worth noting that the widest usage of this term, sexual violence, is really a catch-all word for any kind of systemic or interpersonal harm that's expressed in a sexual way, meaning by sexual words or sexual forms of touch, or perpetrated for a sexual reason. And by that, I mean harm that it's imposed because of a person's sexuality. So an example of that might be discrimination against LGBTQ persons, or historically, like the lynching of Black men that was motivated by a racist belief that they posed a sexual threat to white women. So we're really talking about a large systemic phenomenon, even as we narrow in on some events in the life of Jesus. So again, our title today is Sexual Violence and Belief in the Wake of Crucifixion. In exactly what way, you might ask, does sexual violence relate to Jesus' crucifixion? In ancient Rome, crucifixion was a form of execution reserved for those considered a political threat to the Roman Empire. It was a way for Rome to demonstrate to the empire's diverse population that rebellion would be met with catastrophic consequences and therefore was not in their best interest. A theologian named David Toombs, who's a good colleague of mine, writes, "Crucifixion was intended to be more than an ending of life. Prior to actual death, it sought to reduce the victim to something less than the human in the eyes of society. This was the root of its strength as a ritualized practice of state violence. Crucifixion was designed to ensure that the execution of a politically threatening individual or group would put an end to the wider social movement represented by the ones crucified." So if we were to flip to a contemporary context, we might say crucifixion would be the execution of the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement as a strategy, not simply to quiet their individual voices, but to drain the energy for the wider movement for racial justice. And one of the strategies that Rome used to degrade and dehumanize people who were executed by crucifixion was sexual humiliation. So it was a patriarchal society in which men competed against each other to display their masculinity in terms of sexual power over others. The public display on the cross of the naked victim by the victors in front of onlookers and passers-by carried the message of sexual domination. The cross held up, literally, the victim for display as someone who had been, at least metaphorically speaking, emasculated. Depending on the position in which the person was crucified, and there were many, the display of the genitals could be emphasized. Both Josephus and the Roman historian Seneca the Younger attest to the Romans' enthusiasm for experimenting with different positions on the crucifixion cross. And Seneca's description suggests that the sexual violence against the victim was sometimes taken to a pretty brutal extreme, with genitalia actually impaled on the cross. So, Roman crucifixion, though it's not a part of what we normally think of, carried a pretty strong sexual element. It was a form of sexual abuse that heavily employed the strategy of sexual humiliation to accomplish the goal of stamping out both the person being crucified and that person's political significance for the wider community. The Gospels tell us that as Jesus was beaten and crucified, he was forcibly stripped of his clothes 3 times. Though today's standard crucifix depicts Jesus on the cross with a cloth draped around his waist, historical evidence and the biblical witness suggest that he was mocked by the crowds and nailed to the tree naked. The forced removal of his clothing, the exposure of his genitals to public view, the use of sexual humiliation as a means of torture, and the inclusion of sexual degradation in his murder. These are all characteristics of what Jesus suffered during crucifixion, and they are undeniably acts of sexual violence. It's an uncomfortable truth, and one that often goes unseen and unnamed in Christian devotion. But we can and we should say confidently that Jesus' crucifixion was sexually violent, that Jesus was a victim of sexual violence. So my question for us then is, what does it mean for how we engage sexual violence today to conceive of Jesus as a murdered victim and a resurrected survivor of this form of harm? I realize that I just kind of like threw out the claim that Jesus is a victim of sexual violence, like right up front and center. And some of us might be emotionally or spiritually catching up with that claim, and that's fine. But as we catch up, also just orient yourselves to the question, what would it mean for us? What does it mean for us for how we engage sexual violence today to conceive of Jesus as a murdered victim and a resurrected survivor of this form of harm? What does it mean for our faith? What does it mean for how we show up in the world, how we show up in our own bodies? And what does it mean for our political witness at this day and time? I am aware that, or I think I'm correct and aware that y'all are thinking about and enacting new and creative ways of being present in your own community, or of building creative and different and new connections between the congregation and the community. And so a question I pose specifically for you as we move forward with this for reflection is, what does it mean for the shape of that relationship and for the shape of that work to conceive of Jesus as a murdered victim and a resurrected survivor of sexual violence? I propose that when Christians worship the resurrected Jesus, we are worshiping a victim of sexual abuse. When Christians bear witness to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, we are bearing witness to sexual violence, to the death and trauma it imposes, and to the life that is possible in its aftermath. To care about the suffering of Christ, then, is to care about the suffering of those who have experienced sexual violence. To deny sexual violence or refuse to contend with it is also then to turn away from Jesus. At the heart of Christianity, at the heart of what it means to bear witness to the truth that Christians believe is made manifest through Jesus, is sexual violence. And if we can't be faithful without attending to Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, or to the life that Jesus lived that resulted in these, we also can't be faithful without attending routinely, consistently to sexual forms of harm. So, the accounts of Jesus' crucifixion given in the Gospels don't include a description of sexual assault. But there is reason, I think, that it's worthwhile for us to consider that sexual assault may have occurred. For one, sexual assault would be in line with the strategies of domination that are described in the text and in history books. The repeated stripping of Jesus' clothing, the parading of his naked body before a mocking crowd, and the forced exposure of his genitals as he was fixed to the cross and killed. The possibility that outright sexual assault occurred would merely be an intensification of the sexually violent dimensions of Jesus' crucifixion that are already articulated for us in the text. And another reason that this is something for us to think about is that in contemporary contexts of war and empire, both sexual humiliation and sexual assault are routinely used to accomplish political ends that are consistent with the purpose of Roman crucifixion, namely the quashing of rebellion and the silencing of new liberative movements. Scholars on gendered and sexual dynamics of political warfare have shown time and again that sexual assault has long been used as an intentional strategy to terrorize a targeted population, demoralize the enemy, provide soldiers with the spoils of war, and train them to commit hyperviolent acts. So by training soldiers to commit acts of sexual violence, it is a military strategy that desensitizes the soldiers to behaving in ways that one is socialized to think of as cruel. And therefore, if they can do that, then they will be more effective in all sorts of other forms of war as well, at least is the reasoning in the military strategy. Contemporary patterns of war, of course, can't tell us what did or did not happen in first century Rome, but they are at least suggestive for what Jesus may have suffered. Both Matthew and Mark describe Jesus as being handed over weakened and naked, already a condemned man without any recourse to justice, handed over to soldiers who took him inside the praetorium and assembled the other troops. Both Gospels explicitly state that it was the whole cohort of Roman soldiers, which means between 600 and 1,000 men, that was assembled together to witness and participate in the mockery of Jesus. In view of the facts that, one, we know the Roman military did use sexual assault as a strategy of domination, and two, today's political prisoners testify to being sexually assaulted under circumstances very similar to those Jesus faced in the praetorium. The fact that Jesus was left alone with an overwhelming number of soldiers who were bent on humiliating and degrading him sounds a disturbing tone. What I'm suggesting is that our general knowledge about how sexual assault is used in programs of state terror should make us concerned that Jesus may have been raped or otherwise sexually assaulted when he was alone with the Roman soldiers whose political mission was to destroy him. To hold open possibility that Jesus was sexually assaulted is not the same as making a claim that we know that this is historically true. We don't. If it happened, it's likely to have happened out of view of any of Jesus's loved ones who went on to tell the story of what he was made to endure. If Jesus was sexually assaulted, in other words, it happened the way that sexual assault often does, without leaving the kind of evidence that can be called on to secure knowledge of its historical circumstances for those who weren't there when it happened. We do not and cannot have historical certainty that Jesus either was or wasn't sexually assaulted by the Roman soldiers who crucified him. But it is our lack of access to certainty in one direction or the other that actually becomes significant for thinking about what sexual assault in Jesus' story means for our engagement with the crisis of sexual violence today. Our position of not knowing the extent of the violence Jesus endured is not unlike the position we often find ourselves in with respect to contemporary survivors' testimonies of sexual violence. Consider, for example, the case of an adult, let's call her Maria, who comes forward to report that 20 years prior, when she was 14 years old, her pastor sexually abused her. At the time Maria's community is made aware of what she has suffered, there is no physical evidence that remains. There are no eyewitnesses or written records available to consult. Her community has to decide how to orient itself to her testimony without assistance from the kinds of evidence we have come to regard as necessary for determining historical truth. So here's a relevant question for Christians. If it were Jesus, if it is Jesus, what do we do? If it is reasonable and possible that Jesus was sexually assaulted, and if we are likely to never discover evidence that would serve as proof one way or the other, how should we, theologically, ethically, politically speaking, orient ourselves to the limits of our knowledge of his experience? If it is reasonably possible that the sexual violence perpetrated against Jesus included sexual assault, then those who consider themselves followers of Jesus, I think, must bear witness to this possibility. Christians recognize 4 accounts of the life of Jesus and regard all 4 Gospels as true despite their differences. The Christian tendency in narrating the life of Jesus is to synthesize the stories of the 4 Gospels together. Rather than prioritizing fidelity to one or another of the gospel accounts, it has been the prevailing tradition of Christian spirituality to err on the side of telling the most expansive narrative one can about the life of Jesus. Because the risk of telling too narrow a story about God incarnate towers over the risk of the alternative. Likewise, the risk of failing to bear witness to the possibility that Jesus was sexually assaulted is far graver than the risk of bearing witness to a possibility that was not historically actual. If it's plausibly possible that Jesus was sexually assaulted, not bearing witness to that possibility would mean a Christian failure to bear witness to the suffering of Christ. Many progressive Christians agree that failing to bear witness to the ways that Jesus' life, crucifixion, and resurrection were shaped by the violence of empire leads to devastating incongruities between Jesus' politics and Christian practice. In the same way, failure to bear witness to the sexually violent dimensions of Jesus' life, crucifixion, and resurrection make Christian politics and practice theologically incoherent, and if incoherent, I think also potentially dangerous. For Anabaptists, the call to bear witness is not a call simply to speak with words what one knows about Jesus. It's a call to live one's life in a way that makes Jesus and the socially transformative love of God present in the here and now. So bearing witness is an inherently political act. What makes our social and political practices Christian is the degree to which these are thought of and lived in faithfulness to the life that Jesus modeled. In Anabaptist terms, then, the integrity of Christian discipleship depends on bearing as full a political witness as possible to what Jesus suffered and to the life that led him there. If, again, it is reasonably possible that Jesus was sexually assaulted during crucifixion, Anabaptist Christians have perhaps even a particular responsibility to bear political witness to this possibility. So to get here, to say that Anabaptist Christians have a faithful responsibility to bear witness to the possibility, right? Not the fact, because we're not saying we know for a fact that Jesus was sexually assaulted, but to the possibility that this kind of assault might have occurred. We'd have to depart from 2 key elements of the Western approach to sexual violence. First, Common thinking is that the appropriateness of taking action in response to survivors' testimonies is dependent on a kind of evidence-based certainty. Orienting ourselves to the problem of sexual violence as it manifests in the life of Jesus, however, makes responding to sexual violence warranted on the grounds of reasonable possibility. So there's a difference in what we need in order for us to be responsible and have warrant for taking action. Certainty on one hand, reasonable possibility on the other. Second, a shift happens in our relationships to the limits of our own knowledge. In our contemporary context, if those in a position to hold a perpetrator or an enabler of sexual violence accountable aren't provided with the evidence they feel they need in order to act, the failure of action is not really considered theirs. The survivor is the one who's considered ultimately responsible for producing evidence that certifies her testimony. And for as long as the survivor is unable to do so, their community cannot be blamed for inaction. But when we contemplate the possibility of sexual assault in Jesus' crucifixion, it becomes clearer that those who don't have direct access to survivors' experiences of sexual violence actually have responsibility for the limits of our own knowledge. Instead of regarding Jesus as having failed to supply us with definitive evidence to direct the content of our witness, I think we discover that we have failed insofar as we require evidence-based certainty as the premise for responding in faithful solidarity to the possibility that Jesus was sexually assaulted. We are making a choice to structure our faith and our thinking and our reason in a way that makes us incapable of bearing Jesus' crucifixion as full a witness as it warrants. The limits of our knowledge don't absolve us of the responsibility to act in solidarity with survivors. The fact that our knowledge is limited, and it certainly is, that fact requires us, I think, instead to restructure our thinking and restructure our community practices so that solidarity with survivors is both possible in the midst of our uncertainty and constitutive or basic or fundamental to the shape of our witness. If it is incumbent on Christians to bear witness to the possibility that Jesus was sexually assaulted during crucifixion, a logical next question is how to do this. One way that I think Christians are constrained to bear witness to the possibility of sexual assault in Jesus's life is by holding open that possibility with respect to survivors' testimonies today. Anabaptist theology and ethics have long emphasized Matthew 25:40, in which Jesus tells his followers, "Whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me." In the context of sexual violence, the least of these would be the survivors, particularly those whose experiences of harm leave no concrete proof. Bearing witness to the possibility that Jesus was sexually assaulted means building modes of solidarity with contemporary survivors that can be practiced in the absence of certainty. It means, I think, building practices of intervention based on the authority of credible possibility rather than certainty. It means taking responsibility for the limits of our own knowledge rather than burdening survivors with the task of releasing us from those constraints. It means responding to survivors' testimonies of sexual violence with no less urgency and no less commitment that would be called for in response to the sexual abuse and assault of Jesus, who Christians call God. There are many implications, so many directions that we could go if we were to take this in an absolutely concrete, practical direction. And I'll close by emphasizing three, while I also repeat the question that I opened with, which was, what practical, concrete consequences would there be for the life and faith of your community and your community relationships if we were to regard Jesus as a victim of sexual violence and regard him as possibly a victim and survivor of sexual assault? So here are my three. First, I think Anabaptism would do really well to genuinely center sexual violence in its theological, ethical, and community reflection. Because Jesus was a victim of sexual violence, and because it's possible that he was a victim of sexual assault, and because Anabaptism takes the life of Jesus as kind of a privileged authority for Christian thinking and being, add on to that Anabaptism has thus far not recognized the sexually violent dimensions of Jesus's life, death, and resurrection. It makes sense to me that Anabaptism is in need now of making sexual violence a central and sustained concern, both in how it is paying attention to the biblical text and how it is paying attention to the ethical implications of that text for our lives. Second, I think Anabaptist theology has to reconceptualize its commitment to peace and to community in terms that resist sexual violence and create opportunities for survivors of sexual violence to flourish. Historically, Anabaptist peace theology has not taken sexual violence as a significant area of concern. And the result has been catastrophic for women, for people of color, for LGBTQ+ persons, and for anyone vulnerable to sexual exploitation. Peace theology, of course, is not limited to John Howard Yoder, but his serial sexual violence, the fact that he did it, the fact that he got away with it, the fact that we didn't contend with it for so many years, is indicative of the risks we take when our theology of peace is not organized in any meaningful way around the problem of violence in its sexual form. And third, we need concrete spiritual, theological, social practices that actually make it possible for us to respond in solidarity with survivors when certainty regarding the facts of survivors' testimonies is not available to us. We need strategies. We need creativity and imagination and innovation. We need to bring all the tools of the tradition and all of the wisdom of our global neighbors to bear on the task of dislodging sexual violence from our homes, our communities, and our churches. So I don't propose that we have all the answers for exactly what those strategies are, but we need folks to be animated and inspired and excited about working together to birth them into the world. A long-term focus on sexual violence, reorganizing the pursuit of peace to center that focus, and developing practical strategies of solidarity with survivors are three concrete steps that I think can help us start to hold open possibility with respect to survivors' testimonies of sexual violence today. And if we do this, we'll have the opportunity to begin to bear witness to the sexual violence perpetrated against Jesus and to the possibility that his crucifixion included sexual assault. This is a beginning. The road is long, the path will twist through uncertain terrain to be sure, but we believe that God is with us. And I emphasize believe because I don't think it is a mistake that belief is central to religious relationship and experience with God, as well as it is central to survivors' experiences of solidarity and justice. So we believe that God is with us, and we believe that the creator and sustainer of love and life will nourish us as we embark on the demanding journey ahead and commit ourselves to the generations-long task of seeing it through. Amen.